In one of the streets of Moscow, a man wanders in the middle of the night, and they are surprised by a black car that stops in front of him, and a man gets out of it and they kidnap him. An hour later, he became a lifeless body lying on the edge of the road. Then it turned out that this man was working with the mafia, and the reason for his death was that he had broken the covenant of silence and had spoken about what it was forbidden to talk about. A short and concise scene describing one of the worst rules of the Russian Mafia. This is one of the hundreds of stories that can be told about a terrifying group that is hundreds of years old, and with the passage of time became part of the Russian economic and military conflict. Before we start, please and not in order, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The roots of this story go back to the times of Tsarist Russia, where the rich were the master of the people, the poor were marginalized, and the worker received little money or food for his work. In the 20s of the last century, Tsarist Russia collapsed with the anger of the people, and after the rise of communist rule, all the foundations that were in the era of Tsarist rule changed, and ownership of farms was withdrawn from the peasants in Russia and Ukraine, and the state became the dominant one in all fields. A tragic event for all the workers who found themselves working for the state for nothing. After the state took control of all farms, the Soviet state transferred all agricultural crops from the countryside to the cities to control them as it wanted. This event caused a great famine in the countryside that lasted until the beginning of World War II. That famine created a new thought in the world of crime based on the principle that anything that is not private to anyone should be stolen. Because the Soviet state at that time was stealing agricultural crops from the peasants, and people had to steal from the state in order to get food. So the Soviet state lost a lot because of these thefts. Joseph Stalin decided to put an end to these thefts, considering them a rebellion against the state after he came to power in the Soviet Union. Stalin considered these thefts a rebellion against the state, so he set up many concentration camps outside the cities, and then exiled and arrested entire peoples who objected to his rule. And those camps were not just a prison, but were camps to serve the Soviet state, where prisoners were digging for coal and extending the railways by force in return for a meal only. It was in those brutal camps that the roots of the Russian Mafia began to grow, where groups of thieves formed to steal inside the camp, and fierce conflicts erupted between those groups. The leaders of those groups were called Bakan, and joining these groups has become available to everyone, and this is what made them spread and grow rapidly. The hard work they were forced into was a physical training for them to face the systemic force. Joseph Stalin was watching what was happening inside the camps, and he was aware of these gangs. During World War II, Joseph decided to exploit them and put in place a law stipulating the fight for freedom, as he recruited hundreds of them to fight Nazi Germany. During that war, they were transformed from scattered and poorly organized gangs into organized and trained military units. After the end of World War II and they were released, the time came for their financial coffers to flourish and to turn into the Russian Mafia, which today is known to be the most dangerous to launch. And while the Russian Mafia controlled cities and society, the Soviet Union was weakening and retreating militarily. After the death of Joseph Stalin, the Mafia had a golden opportunity to control the state and the people. And during the rule of Leonid Brezhnev, the Mafia economy flourished, carrying out smuggling and armed robbery on a larger scale, due to the collapse of the security grip imposed on it by Stalin. Mafia bosses have turned into leaders of countries that the authorities cannot approach. Therefore, instead of going to the judiciary to get their rights back, people go to the mafia boss to get their rights back for a certain agreed-upon percentage. All that was lacking in the Russian Mafia was the extensive experience in the pillars of the state, which it has already gained during Gorbachev's accession to power in the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Russian intelligence system, many intelligence officers joined the Russian Mafia, an event that helped them greatly in the field of money laundering. Also, many nuclear scientists and former members of the Communist Party joined them, which increased the popularity of the mafia and the decline of state authority. Russia has become effectively ruled by the mafia, which is concerned with resolving popular dispute. The mafia's power escalated during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it reached the peak of power and influence with the birth of the modern Russian state, which had a difficult task ahead of it, which was to eliminate the mafia. But something happened that made the task of eliminating the mafia an impossible task. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian mafia earned a lot of money, establishing legal businesses inside the country, and thus becoming one of the pillars of the Russian economy, and eliminating it will harm the Russian economy. Also, the Russian mafia was supported by several powerful governments such as the United Kingdom, French and American governments, and managed to control the Russian company Yukos, which is considered one of the largest oil companies in the world. As mentioned earlier, during the 1990s, the Russian mafia penetrated into companies and businesses thanks to the money it received from some American and European sources controlled by Western Jews. It can be said that this mafia has established a state within a state, as it works with several countries and intelligence services to carry out some secret mission. The man who runs the Russian mafia so far is the 76-year-old Russian Jew Semyon Mogilevich, who has 3 nationalities: Russia, Ukraine, and Hungary. EU intelligence and US intelligence described him as the leader of the Russian mafia bosses. The FBI says he is one of the most dangerous mafia bosses in the world. Mogilevich's strength comes from the huge financial treasury, as he controls one of the largest gas companies in Russia, and is considered a partner in Raiffeisen Bank. The second source of Mogilevich's strength is that he has close ties to many Russian politicians. Although his name is at the top of the world's most wanted list, he still lives safely in the Russian capital Moscow, where he has some kind of alliances with politicians including the mayor of Moscow and the former head of security in Ukraine. Some Western sources estimate the wealth of the Jew Mogilevich at $10 billion. And some sources indicate that the leader of the Russian mafia has a close relationship with President Vladimir Putin. Currently, Russia has become a mafia country that controls its gang as it wants. And this was recently reported in several reports that the Russian mafia infiltrated Ukraine and began moving at night to create chaos and carry out the operations it received from Moscow. This event prompted Ukraine to launch a battalion in the name of the Shadow War to counter the movements of the Russian mafia inside Ukraine. At the end of this episode, we can say that 100 years after the launch of the Russian mafia, it succeeded in taking advantage of the political fluctuations and conflicts to transform from wanted criminals and gangs into a mafia that controls 40% of the Russian economy. And here ends today's episode. Do not forget to subscribe to this humble channel, if you do not mind.